See, if I don't see them, then I can imagine there are like 2,000.
That's probably what teaching was like for you during the pandemic, huh?
Imagine it was 2,000.
No, did you have to talk to a blank screen?
Oh, well, not blank, because no, you'd see the class. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I liked it, actually.
Good.
I've only just started not liking Zoom teaching, but before, for a while, I thought this is all I want to do forever. And now I've slowly come around to thinking, oh, that's right. I actually like being around people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it looks like we have quite a few people. We'll give it one more minute, and then we will get started this evening. So, Carl, what did you like about teaching on Zoom?
Well, I mean, first of all, I love wearing casual clothes, and parking is terrible on my campus, so I love not having to find a parking space. And unlike a lot of faculty members who seem to be clueless about how to use Zoom, I guess I'm a little more with it, but I had also been doing an online cooking show on Instagram.
Yes.
And I think this had made me very much at ease with the camera. So by the time the Zoom thing came around, I just thought, oh, I'm just staring into my computer instead of my phone in my kitchen. So yeah, it was fine. And I still like the immediacy. If students want to meet with me, I can sometimes say, oh, are you free in 20 minutes? And there's not like getting across town to meet them or something.
Right,
so
sign on.
It's convenient in different ways.
Yeah, I agree. There's a lot of things I've liked about the convenience. Of course, I'm the person that I did like grocery pickup and delivery before the pandemic. There were some things like that I loved, those time savers, that just gave me time to do other things that I enjoyed more. But I always say I want the whole world to like work like a Sonic, where I just put in an order and then it comes out to me. That would be very happy to live the rest of my life like that. But it's also nice to be in person again. It's also nice to see people again. And we have a shout out to Carl's cooking class over on chat. So I think it's a pretty good time to get started here. So we have everyone. So I'm going to start. I want to welcome everyone here this evening to the River Styx reading series, and thank you for joining us virtually again. My name is Angela Mitchell, and I am the interim editor-in-chief of River Styx, and I'll be your host for this evening's program. If you feel so moved to make a $5 donation, you will find the link to our offering plate over in the chat box. Before we begin, I would also like to thank the following for their ongoing financial support: the Regional Arts Commission, the Missouri Arts Council, the Missouri Humanities Council, the National Endowment for the Arts, and the Kranzberg Arts Foundation. I'd also like to thank our co-host tonight, Left Bank Books. We want to encourage you to purchase our authors' books there if you have not already. And Molly Harris, our managing editor, will be dropping the link to that to order online over in the chat room as well. I'd like to remind everyone to please keep your connection muted while our guests are speaking. And if you would like to offer praise or comments, please feel free to send those via the chat box feature, and we will certainly read those at the end of the program. Or during the Q&A, you are welcome to unmute yourself to ask questions. The entirety of this event is being recorded and will be posted on YouTube, so please feel free to share it far and wide. So thank you everyone for being here. We are really excited, of course, for the two authors that we have here tonight, Carl Phillips and Sophia Abdur Rahman. We have their books, and I hope that you will pick these up at Left Bank. We have Carl's new book, Then the War, and Sophia's Heir to the Crescent Moon. Just beautiful, both have beautiful covers there. So very, very excited about that. So to get started this evening, we'd like to begin with Sophia, and I'm happy to introduce her here. Sophia Abdur Rahman is the author of the memoir Heir to the Crescent Moon, winner of the Iowa Prize for Literary Nonfiction. Her essays, articles, and criticism have appeared in publications including Catapult, The Common Online, Gay Mag, The Washington Post, Chicago Tribune, and NPR. She has earned notable distinction in Best American Essays, received fellowships from the Sustainable Arts Foundation, and is a two-time alumnus of VONA writing workshops. She is creative nonfiction editor for Cherry Tree, a national literary journal at Washington College, where she teaches creative writing and journalism. Sophia lives in Annapolis, Maryland, with her family. Please welcome Sophia Abdur Rahman.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yes, that Annapolis, Maryland part is the reason why I showed up here an hour earlier. So glad to be here at the right time tonight. Yes, Heir to the Crescent Moon is my debut book. It's a memoir about my journey in discovering my relationship to Islam. I am the daughter of two Black Power era converts to Islam and from New York City. And I had questions about their history, my parents' history when I was growing up, and wanted to find out more about it, which led me ultimately to write this book. My parents converted some years after the assassination of Malcolm X. Today is actually the 57th anniversary of that assassination. So I wanted to dedicate my reading tonight to the life of Malcolm X and his memory, which lives on. I want to read a couple of sections to you, starting with the first real chapter called The Opening. The house I grew up in on Long Island's South Shore was my parents' last stop out of the Bronx, out of struggling to earn a living, on their way to building a comfortable middle-class existence for themselves and the family they had created together. The house's shingles were dark scarlet, like the blood my mother washed away when one of my siblings or I fought concrete for knee skin and lost. They were black cherry, like chunks in the vanilla ice cream my father scooped after another day spent dealing with white folks on his job. It had 4 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms, a garage, multicolored slabs of stone forming our back patio, thick vines of ivy climbing our rear fence, and a cherry and an apple tree blossoming in our front yard. A pair of windows poked from the second-story roof like widened eyeballs, attuned to everything going on outside in our small Baldwin neighborhood. But inside was home. My brothers, Muhammad and Isa, shared the room upstairs on the left. Across a tiny hallway, my big sister, Aaliyah, and I claimed our room on the right. My parents' bedroom was on the main level, but my father really spent most of his time in the room beside it, his office. Downstairs in the living room was where we all gathered before bedtime to pray. Aaliyah, Isa, Sophia, Muhammad, come downstairs. My father in his booming bass called us from oldest to youngest. And as though responding to a bolt of lightning, we all came running down the steps, consecutive claps of thunder. We plopped into various cross-legged positions atop couch cushions, covered with midnight blue bed sheets, speckled white with images of twinkling stars. Each of us bowed our heads, closed our eyes, and before our faces, parted and slightly cupped our hands as if poised to catch falling raindrops. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen, ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I found such comfort in prayer. I prayed with my family every night back then. My ears would perk when our voices rose in unison, uttering a series of foreign words, some more challenging to pronounce than others. Maliki yawmiddin, Iyyaka na'budu wa iyyaka nasta'in. It was like singing a song, this prayer of ours. Abi led with a commanding baritone. My mother, Umi, accompanied with a harmonic alto. Aaliyah, Isa, Muhammad, and I followed, poorly trained sopranos. Most of the tune was monotone, but in the places where the notes rose an octave or dipped to a depth I had to work to reach, the payoff was an audible beauty. Ehdina siratil mustaqim. I had no idea what the words meant. I never heard them spoken anywhere outside our own home. I only knew they were what we were supposed to say when praying to Allah, and I liked the sound of them. The way they rolled around in my mouth differently than the words I'd been saying all day. then slipped out and floated up like a ribbon of incense smoke into God's ear. Siratil echdina an amta aleichem, gairul makdubi aleichem, waladaulin, amin. Instead of raindrops, I imagined Allah dropped his blessings into my open palms during the prayer. When it ended, I brought the edges of my hands together, careful not to let any gaps form between my fingers through which his grace could slip, and covered my nose, mouth, and eyes. Washing the blessing outward over my forehead, cheeks, and chin, I was cleansed. I opened my eyes to see my family around me, still drawn close. That was the end of chapter 1. I'm going to skip ahead about 11 chapters to chapter 12, which is called Surrender at the Cinema. What you need to know between this section is that my parents, who had been together, split up, and myself and my younger brother went to live with my mother. And my older siblings were elsewhere. I think that's about it, all you need to know. It was the middle of my school day, maybe third or fourth period, and I had just gotten settled in class when a messenger appeared in the doorway. She called my name, said I'd better get my things. I was wanted in the main office. Haphazardly, I stuffed books into my book bag while trying to match my guide's purposeful pace through the halls. I'd never been called out of class before. What could the principal want with me, I wondered, knowing I hadn't done anything wrong. Your father's here, the lady offered, reading my mind. He said there's a family emergency. I reached the office, and Muhammad, who should have been at his school a mile away, was sitting there somberly next to Abi, who stood looking grave. He thanked the staff, and we three turned to leave without a word between us. In our silence, my heart beat with a strength I thought unnatural for a 12-year-old girl, but just right for a grown woman. Though I wanted to ask Abi what had happened, I was too afraid to learn the answer. I'd already cried my way through the funerals of both of my grandmothers. I imagined soon having to bite my lip while standing at the casket of one of my grandfathers too. Or, just as bad, we could have been on our way to visit Aaliyah or Isa, hooked up to ventilators and feeding tubes in a hospital. We sulked toward my father's van. It was an ugly thing, rust brown with actual rust spots eating the metal, overhanging the tires. A fat, mega block-like body, not sleek or discreet in any way. Tinted windows covered with blinds, as if anyone would want to peek inside after seeing the exterior. And on the van floor, a shag carpet and a medley of brown, orange, and white, completing the "I got this at a garage sale" effect. It was a huge departure from the impeccable black Pontiac Trojan Abi used to pick us up in. All the kids lingering in front of the building after school would ooh and ah when it grumbled into the driveway. Like Kit from Knight Rider, it was low to the ground with a pointy front end, flat back end, and headlights that flipped up like blinking eyes. Umi called the sports car his midlife crisis. Abi got it when he was 40. By 41, he totaled it. And because, according to my mother, he hadn't bothered to get insurance, I was forced to ride around in that doo-doo brown, low-budget A-Team knockoff van. Still, I climbed inside. My face fell, becoming just as drawn as theirs in anticipation of the worst news. But then Muhammad and Abi burst out laughing. Broad smiles spread across their lips. My brother grabbed his sides. My father wheezed a little. "Ha ha, got you," Muhammad said between guffaws, doubled over as if to emphasize the hilarity of their joke. "I just needed a good excuse for taking you all out of school early," Abi explained. "That's not funny," I said, trying but failing to repress a smile. "Then where are we going?" "Ah, I can't tell you that," Abi said. "It's a surprise, but don't worry, it's a good one." With the way I felt about him then, I couldn't have been less interested in my father's surprise. Every time he picked Muhammad and me up from school and brought us to our home, I was reminded that it was his fault we even needed a ride. We had moved twice since Abi booted us from his home, first to a house in Uniondale where we started going to school, and now a year later to an apartment in Hempstead that was too small, had mice, and wasn't even in the district where my mother still sent Muhammad and me to school. I would have preferred not to go anywhere with Abi that day, or any day, but he was my father. I didn't have a choice. I stared out the window, searching for clues to reveal where we were going as we drove out of one Long Island town and into another. Part of me was a detective, trying to discover our destination without being told. The other part, a protector, keeping track of our route in case Muhammad and I needed to make a run for it. Whatever we were doing, why couldn't it wait until after school, I wondered. I continued to study the streets and note landmarks along our way, dropping breadcrumbs. Deeper into Hempstead, I knew of only a handful of places we visited nearby: the flea market, Western Beef, the African American Museum that never seemed to be open, a Black bookstore, White Castle, and the movie theater. Everything we passed with so far was familiar. I thought if Abi was trying to escape with us, he wasn't doing a very good job of obscuring his route. When we made a right onto North Franklin Street, I became pretty sure we were just going to the movies. The Hempstead Theater was small, run down, and practically unknown to people who didn't live nearby. It was almost always nearly empty, but just beyond a corridor of wood and metal scaffolding along the sidewalk that led to the ticket window, I could make out a small line. I'd never seen one there before. When we got to the front, Abi spoke like a king, commanding subjects with his resounding depth. One adult and two children for Malcolm X. So that was why we were there. It was opening day for Spike Lee's biopic on the influential Black Muslim leader that everyone on the news and in the streets had spent all summer and fall of 1992 talking about. I had seen the baseball caps emblazoned with the letter X that vendors along Harlem's 125th Street were selling. I'd admired the huge posters picturing Malcolm X in brow-line glasses with his pursed lips, dimpled chin, and pointed finger above his famous words, "by any means necessary." I'd noticed men wearing t-shirts portraying him in various poses with an array of profound quotes. The movie seemed to have resurrected the man so well that there was almost a movement surrounding the movie, Malcolm X. I didn't think anybody in the Black community, let alone my father, would miss it. Going to the movies was probably his favorite pastime, and Malcolm, his hero. We had to be first. What you'll see in this film is more important than any lessons you would have learned in school today, Abi said, leading us inside. We sat down a few rows from the screen in seats lumpy, dingy, and gray. The material was so worn, I couldn't tell for sure whether it had once been velvet, but I suspected it was. Duct tape covered tears in several places, but at least the colors matched. I wriggled around until I found a spot where springs weren't poking me too hard in my butt and back, then questioned whether we were there to support a theater in a Black neighborhood or because it was the only one around that would show Malcolm X. At first, staring up at the screen, watching Lee and Denzel Washington sway down the street in zoot suits was not quite what I expected from a movie about the transformative minister the country had largely tried to erase from memory, but it was entertaining. The whole theater crackled with laughter when Detroit Red jumped out of his chair, feeling the sting of lie as he got his hair combed. We laughed harder when none of the faucets worked and Red eventually had to dunk his head in toilet water to relieve the burning. Just before the intermission, there was an intermission, I sat rapt watching a militant cadre of brothers from the Nation of Islam soundlessly stand guard amid a screaming mob. The protesters rallied outside the hospital where a Black man lay after being badly beaten by police. Officers were on edge, thinking they'd soon have to quell a riot. But when Minister Malcolm dispersed the unruly crowd with a simple flick of his leather-gloved hand, my father beamed. He leaned over, his black leather jacket crunching under the weight of his movements, and told me, that's just how it was, as if he'd actually been there. By the time Malcolm X found Sunni Islam, I was lost in the film. His transformation from street criminal to dogged purveyor of Black pride to man ensconced in self-discovery through his recognition of the humanity within Islam was confusing and yet made total sense. This man was tortured by his past, his rough upbringing, and by his everyday existence as a Black man in a country that didn't respect Black men. He needed Islam. It saved him. In submission, Malcolm knelt inside a beautiful chandeliered and red carpeted mosque during his pilgrimage to Mecca. He prayed in Arabic. From my lumpy seat, I mumbled the words along with him. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, we opened the prayer. Except at meal times, I hadn't prayed with anyone since moving out of Abi's house. I wanted to, but the shape of my family had bent, folded, and severed under the pressure of Abi's absence. My sister, Aliyah, who was entering her senior year when we moved, largely ignored me as she spent all her time out with friends or on the phone with them. My older brother, Issa, who didn't want to change schools and mess up his straight A record or abandon his horde of friends, eventually, out of convenience, just moved back into Abi's house. By the time I'd entered 8th grade that year, Aliyah had gone off to college and only Muhammad, my mother, and I were left living together. My family had split up, just as I'd feared. I longed to forge my faith connection again, but Abi had always been the one to facilitate our prayers, gathering us in the living room to sit on sheet-covered couch cushions in our pajamas before bed each night. Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen, Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim. At the new house, I had sometimes lain at night with the lights off and my sister's often empty bed across the darkened room from mine, whispering the prayer to myself or reciting it soundlessly in my head before I fell asleep. Maliki Yawmiddin, Iyyaka na'budu wa iyyaka nasta'in. But I had begun to forget some of the words. I always stumbled at the same point, losing the melody in my train of thought after I reached, it is thee we worship, thee we ask for help. I tried forcing myself to remember, to recall the mingling of Abi's baritone with Umi's harmonic alto in my head, as I used to hear in our living room, but it was hard to conjure what was no longer there. And I doubted that my little brother across the hall from me remembered how to pray. Nor did Umi, who always fell asleep hours before me anyway, and sometimes used to let Abi's calls to prayer go unanswered, seem like the right person to ask to join me. Without my family surrounding me, and with my unfettered connection to God broken, I felt alone in my Islam. So even if only listening to a celluloid character recite the prayer, it felt good to hear someone else utter those words again. In them, I sensed Malcolm X's complete surrender to the will of Allah. It was just a movie, but the scene made me reach back through time and space to traverse fantasy into reality and truly feel for Brother Malcolm, and through him, reconnect with my faith in God. Akhdina Siratul Mustaqim, he continued. That was it. Guide us on the straight path. I read the English translation of the prayer in white type along the bottom of the screen, checking it for accuracy, while taking note of the Arabic phrasings that had escaped me. As I did, I wondered whether the rest of the theater felt as profoundly for Malcolm X as I did then. In time, I mouthed with him, Waladawin Ameen, closing the prayer. Listening to that meditative recitation of the prayer, labored yet uplifting, gave me back something I hadn't realized I'd lost. It filled me with warmth, though I hadn't noticed I'd been shivering. It struck me then that maybe by taking Muhammad and me to see how Malcolm Little became Malcolm X, and Malcolm X became Al-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz, Abi was trying to show us how and why he became who he was, why at times he struggled to control his anger, why he demanded so much from us and from Blacks as a whole, maybe why he'd been attracted to Islam and to Umi, his Betty, in the first place. I realized that perhaps Abi didn't want us only to watch the movie, but maybe to see in it some of ourselves as well, some of our heritage. In Malcolm X, the movie, and more importantly, the man, I had discovered a link to who I was as a Muslim. This was worth leaving school for. I don't know whether he meant to, but Abi managed to begin replacing the image of him that had haunted me for months. And in the process, he'd finally given me a reason to stop being mad at him. He revealed that he cared enough about me to teach me about myself. Leaving the theater, Abi, Muhammad, and I maneuvered around a small crowd of people that had amassed outside, waiting for their chance to watch Malcolm Little transform into Al-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz. Among them, I felt as if I'd been part of something special. "How was it, brother?" An older man with a graying beard asked Abi as we passed him in line. A black and gold patterned knit cap encircled his head. He might have been Muslim. Looking at Abi with his own beard and baseball cap shielding his head, the man might have recognized that we were too. "Great," Abi said, guiding Muhammad and me into the street with a light touch of his fingers on our backs. Powerful. Stop there. Thank you. I think you're muted, Angela. Oh no, take yourself off mute.
Unmute. I'm on mute. Okay, so I start again. Okay. So I'm not doing as well on Zoom as I would like to. I wanted to say that was beautiful. Thank you for reading those chapters. I really loved hearing those. And I also want to make sure that you check out the chat and see a number of really beautiful words that are being said to you. So you can check out your fan base over there. So thank you. We'll go ahead and move on to our next reader, and then when we're finished, we'll return to some questions. So our next reader, of course, is Carl Phillips. Carl Phillips is the author of 15 previous books of poetry, most recently Pale Colors in a Tall Field and Wild is the Wind, which won the Los Angeles Times Book Prize. Other honors include the 2021 Jackson Prize, the Aiken Taylor Award for Modern American Poetry, the Kingsley Tufts Award, a Lambda Literary Award, the Penn USA Award for Poetry, and fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the Library of Congress, the American Academy of Arts and Letters, and the Academy of American Poets. Phillips has also written 3 prose books. Most recently, My Trade is Mystery, 7 Meditations from a Life in Writing. And he has translated the Philoctetes of Sophocles. He teaches at Washington University in St. Louis. It is our honor to welcome Carl Phillips.
All right, thank you. Thanks for the introduction. Thank you, Sophia, for that wonderful and very powerful reading. And I just want to ask, does this sound fine so far? Okay. Once in a while I get this thing saying my internet is unstable, but it seems stable to me. All right. So yeah, I'm going to read some poems and just writing something down here so I'll know when to stop. And thanks, and thank you, Angela, for inviting me and having us here. Okay, this poem is called And If I Fall. There's this cathedral in my head I keep making from cricket song and dying but rogue in spirit still bamboo. Not making, I keep imagining it as if that were the same thing as making, and as if making might bring it back somehow, the real cathedral. In anger, as in desire, it was everything, that cathedral. I conduct my body as if my body itself cathedral. I conduct my body with the cathedral's steadiness. I try to. I cathedral, in desire, in anger. Light enters a cathedral the way persuasion fills a body. Light enters a cathedral the way persuasion fills a body. All right. This is called In a Low Voice Slowly. So stubborn and as if almost necessary, this little wind playing the leaves, their surfaces, playing the leaves where they lie fallen, while not once rearranging them. Like being asked, what, if anything, do you regret at this point? And as answer, shaping your own smallish song around how knowing isn't understanding, isn't mystery either, which isn't unknowing, not exactly, more like deciding to turn abruptly east after so many years westering. What kind of answer was that? Sometimes the past seems the stuff of heraldry, figures proper on a ground of good and evil. Other times, the past sways ocean-like above me. There's a sound deer still make when in sixes they come down from the hills at sunrise, the kind of sunrise where no sun's visible, but it's daylight and just the rain and the deer passing like their own form of light through it. Their hooves mark the damp ground incidentally, no particular meaning. It's true that love marks the body. I'm reading my little poem map here of what I'm supposed to do next, but I can't read the map. So I'm just gonna guess. This poem is called Electric. I don't exactly know why, but that's what it's called. Electric. It's a calm night, the kind of calm inside which, hours after having entered another's body with your own body, you wonder, did that happen? Any of it? And then the staggering away home from it, as if from a crime scene or the grottoed site of some miracle believed in, but by enough pilgrims to make it seem almost true. It's as if the calm contains the night, which contains the fears that only exist finally inside you. Each fear being different, each contains its own dream. Is dream the word? Vision, maybe? Except invisible, the way certain gestures are. The gesture of sorrow when it shifts, the way a storm shifts to something easier to bear than sorrow. A hawk tearing not so slowly at a smaller bird that's still breathing. A man thinking that by withdrawing from the conversation, he's taken control of the conversation. I've known more than a few men like that. Sex in colors, names like believe me or don't, whatever. Tattoos like dangerous and don't disturb and it's a long life if you're lucky. And you were right all along. It was love. And I wish you more time. And when they most needed bandaging, he covered my eyes, the skin of his hands, like deer skin. I would say something illuminating between poems, but I don't have anything to say. I like the poems to sort of speak for themselves. All right, foliage. Cage inside a whispering so deep that, and then just the two of us. And you calling it vulnerability. And me calling it rumor passing through suspicion's fingers, ashweed, flickering halo of the boy I might really have been once, tiger lilies beneath the storm, blowing into, then out of character, then back again, as if seasonal, summer now, now fall. But I know suspicion has no fingers. Vulnerability is just part of the trash that rumor leaves behind. Waited out long enough, the trash shifts. It always does. In that way, it's like memory lately. I'm the fist of instinct, cool, unstoppable. You're the dogwood's crucifix-laden branches. I'm the fist through the branches. You're the fist. I'm the branches. Perhaps something a little less violent. This poem is called Sing a Darkness. Slowly, the fog did what fog does eventually. It lifted, the way veils tend to at some point in epic verse, so that the hero can see the divinity at work constantly behind all things mortal. Or that's the idea anyway. I'm not saying I do or don't believe that. I'm not even sure that belief can change any of it, at least in terms of the facts of how, moment by moment, any life unfurls. We can call it fate, or call it just what happened. What happens while we're busy trying to describe or explain what happens. How a mimosa tree caught growing close beside a house gets described as hugging the house, for example, as if an impulse to find affection everywhere made us have to put it there, a spell against indifference, as if that were the worst thing. Is it? Isn't it? The fog lifted. It was early spring still. The dogwood brandished those pollen-laden buds that precede a flowering. History, what survives or doesn't. How the healthiest huddled as much at least as was possible, more closely together to give the sick more room. How they mostly all died all the same. I was nowhere I'd ever been before. Nothing mattered. I practiced standing as still as I could, for as long as I could. I'm looking at a piece of paper in case it looks like I'm just suddenly falling into a narcoleptic fit. I'm not. Okay, this poem is called Storm. Storm. Believe it or not, all I meant to do was go look at where the Missouri and the Mississippi meet each other. There's a little park area. But I came away with this poem, or at least I came away with the idea that turned into the poem. Storm. From the waist down, at least, nothing unfamiliar. Cypress trees, the catalpa, its seed pods hanging like shadow icicles, and the light around them, and the bodies that enter the light and leave it, your own among them. But as when the body seems most to want, impossibly, to step free of itself, oblivion of wish, of wishing. About sanctuary, how over time it makes the birds come closer. How that's different from trust, isn't it? What the fuck do you think you're looking at? He says softly. What a thing to say. The mind protecting itself by shutting down an intimacy that most likely won't be returned. Why expect it? As if that were the mind's chief purpose, to resist a fall, though falling's what the body does best, is quick to rise for, moving toward you with all the ceremony of many wings at once outspread, a holiday descending. The dark adjusts itself, settles its wings inside you. The shadows that strut the dark open and fold like hope, a paper fan, violence in its pitch and fall, like waves. Above them, the usual seabirds, their presumable indifference to chance, its blonde convergences. As when telling cruelty apart from chivalry can come to seem irrelevant or not anymore the main point. He touches himself here and here, directive, turns his face away. It can look like ransom. Now it looks like privilege, now recklessness, now triumph, gravel and blood, humiliation, lovely, now strict refrain. He taketh my hand in his. No, just another day having a picnic by the river. All right. Much shorter poem. Whose title is, well, first of all, the title is Of the Shining Underlife, and that title is from a line by Toy Derricott from her poem, The Minx, of the shining underlife. Above me, the branches toss toward and away from each other, the way privacy does with what ends up showing, despite ourselves, of who we are inside. Then they're branches again. Hickory, I think. It's not too late then. Short, huh? This is called To Autumn. I felt very nervy calling a poem To Autumn because Shelley, I think, Keats, somebody has a poem called To Autumn. And then later Louise Glick does. And then I thought, well, I guess now I do. To Autumn. Whatever it is that some nights can rescue cricket song from becoming just more of the usual white noise, tonight it's working. The hours toss with the apparent weightlessness of leaves when each leaf seems for once its own dream, not part of the larger, more general dream of leaves being limited to tossing with either diminishment or renewal, when why should those be the only choices? What about joy and despair? What about ambition? If wild, I was once more gentle. There's a version of autumn where the stars' reflections on the river tonight look at one moment like freight thrown overboard, at the next like signal lights cast up through water by a city submerged where the river's deepest. There's another version. Holiness has no limits there, only two requirements: to be hidden, to adore what's hidden. Okay, we're moving into the home stretch here. Here's a poem called Civilization. Civilization. There's an art to everything. How the rain means April and an ongoingness like that of song until at last it ends. A centuries-old set of silver handbells that once an altar boy swung, processing. You're the same wilderness you've always been, slashing through briars the bracken of your invasive self. So he said, in a dream. But the rest of it, all the rest, was waking, more often than not to the next extravagance. Back. Is everything okay, Angela?
We lost you for just a minute. So if you can just rewind by
Right.
like 30 seconds.
I'm gonna
that'd be great.
rewind.
Just rewind a little.
I saw the screen go blank and I thought, oh, I'll just stare it back into sensation. Okay, I'm just gonna start off this poem over. Civilization. There's an art to everything. How the rain means April and an ongoingness like that of song until at last it ends. A centuries-old set of silver handbells that once an altar boy swung, processing. You're the same wilderness you've always been, slashing through briars, the bracken of your invasive self. So he said, in a dream. But the rest of it, all the rest, was waking, more often than not, to the next extravagance. Two Blackamoor statues, each mirroring the other, each hoisting forever upward his burden of hand-painted, carved by hand peacock feathers. Don't you know it? Don't you know I love you? He said. He was shaking. He said, I love you. There's an art to everything. What I've done with this life, what I'd meant not to do, or would have meant maybe, had I understood. though I have no regrets. Not the broken but still flowering dogwood, not the honey locust either, not even the ghost walnut with its non-branches whose every shadow is memory, memory. As he said to me once, that's all garbage down the river now, turning, but as the utterly lost because addicted do. Resigned all over again. It only looked, it must only look like leaving. There's an art to everything, even turning away, how eventually even hunger can become a space to live in, how they made out of shamelessness something beautiful for as long as they could. Okay, I'm gonna read two more poems, and I think that will be my time. I'm going to read, okay, this poem called Anywhere Like Peace. Now I'm afraid any moment that I'm going to dissolve into the ether. But I'll know I'm here. And I maybe even be dissolved. But if I don't know I'm dissolved, then I'm here. All right, this is called Anywhere Like Peace. He's unbuttoning his shirt. We've never met before. He says last night he had a dream about me. A good dream, he tells me. A strong one, meaning I was strong. And that for the first time in years, apparently, he felt completely safe. To confuse closure with conclusion is nothing new, I at first want to say to him. But a shadow softness to his face brings out a softness in me that I don't show usually. It makes me want to lean hard into his chest instead, the part where the hair, faint still, as if still filling in, looks like two wings positioned where they shouldn't be, but on purpose, so that flight means for once not seeing the earth fall away, but the sky getting steadily closer. Let the body approach. Will I ever stop wanting more than what I've already got? I used to wonder, not realizing yet that's all ambition is finally. I thought humility would be a smaller thing, a quieter thing. It seems I was wrong about that too. I can't decide if it's just my being so much older now, or if it's always been true that winter foliage is the prettiest foliage. Okay, I'm going to end with this poem called All the Love You've Got. It was banned once, but don't let that. Doesn't have to be banned here, right? All the love you've got. And now, having dismissed everyone as he wishes he could dismiss his own dreams that make each night restless, that same unswayable knowledge and the belief in it that he is king here, which means being a stranger, at least outwardly, to even the least trace of doubt. After all of this, the king has stepped from the royal tent, is walking toward the sound of water where the river must be. There's the river, rivering south, as rivers tend to. Beside the river, two men are fucking. Young men, almost too young to even know about fucking, thinks the king, who can't help noticing how the men bring a somehow grace to the business between them, a grace that some might confuse with love. The king rarely makes mistakes, which is to say, he knows mercy when he sees it. What does mercy have to do with fucking? What does love have to do with grace? What are dreams but the only rivers memory knows how to make? There's a kind of music to how the men routinely but unpredictably trade places, entering and withdrawing from each other. It's as if they're singing a song that might go, I'm the king. No, you're the king and I'm the river. No, you're the river. On and on, like that. Leave them. They do no harm. The king making his slow, insomniaed way back. The night dark, but not dark entirely. Moonless, yes, but through the pines, enough stars still visible. Whoever goes there, let me pass. Beneath the brocaded cloak, each bead stitched to it by hand. Beneath the cloak of some more breathable, lighter fabric beneath that, the king's cock rests like tenderness itself against the king's left thigh. How soft the stars look. Thanks. I didn't dissolve.
You didn't dissolve. Thank you. That was
Thank
wonderful.
you.
So we have some questions. We have some comments in the chat. I want to open this up first. If there's someone who has a question that you would really like to ask either one of our readers, either Sophia or Carl, I do want to go ahead and do that. We have one actually here in the chat that I'll start with, and I want to ask your forgiveness for my cat. She loves readings, and she always at some point decides to join along. So this is Zoe, and she enjoyed your reading very much. So I have a question here for Sophia from the audience. Sophia, memoir can be tough. How has your family reacted to the book? And did your siblings end up seeking Islam?
Thank you for the question. That's an interesting one, because I mean I have 5 siblings, and so you can imagine that the reactions were mixed. Some were probably a little bit taken back, like, okay, why did you write this book in the first place? Some thought it was great and felt like this was the story to tell. And it is what it is. I wrote it for me. I told my version of the story. They each have their own version of the story. And I think the second part of the question was, I'm trying to find the question again. And did my siblings end up seeking Islam? So it's really, I think that's part of the reason why I wrote the book. My book is dedicated to my siblings, who are varied and who I love dearly, each one of them. But no, nobody else did end up seeking Islam. I have one brother who became Christian, who joined a church and is very Christian now. I have another who changed his name so that it has no Arabic in it anymore. I have, different people have done different things. And so I think that that's part of the reason why I wanted to tell this story, because even though we come from the same family, and this happens with, lots of second generation Black Muslims, everyone goes their own way and is doing their own thing. And I wanted to find out more about where that divergence was coming from. I wanted to tell more of the story of, here was the foundation, and then here are all the branches that have sprouted up because of where it started. And I started off telling the story through more journalistically, interviewing people and, reporting on the different stories that were out there, but then got drawn more into my own story and trying to investigate my own journey. And that's the story that I ended up telling. So, yeah.
Thank you. So another question we have here, and I think, and in some ways there's a question here for Carl, and it could also, we can take a part of it for Sophia as well. But so, hi Carl, this was wonderful. Thank you. I was wondering if you could talk about the process of curating Then the War. What surprised you? Did you find resonances with and/or divergences from your earlier selected collection? And also, there's a question there, also a banned poem with some question marks. So wanting to know a little bit more about that. I think it's a great question about curating this particular book. And I also at some point want to ask Sophia about the process of putting together her memoir and what that experience was like. But please go ahead, Carl.
Sure. Well, this book came about in a kind of awkward, well, not awkward, just a weird way. I had no idea that there were going to be selected poems as part of this book. I just wrote a book called Then the War, which is the first 80 pages of the book that now exists. And I turned that book in, and that book was taken. So I was just thinking I had another regular book of poems. And then a publisher in England, Carcanet, contacted my publisher and said that they would like to somehow introduce me to the UK and do some kind of big kind of thing like selected poems. And I didn't want to do a selected poems. I kind of opposed to it. And well, I'm not opposed to selected poems, but I didn't want to have a book that would seem like new and selected. I can't stand that. Most people do new and selected, and that usually means like they have 12 new poems and then a whole bunch of old stuff. So it always feels like they're stalling for time because they don't have a real book yet. And at which point I think, stay home and write your book then. So my publisher here said, well, you know, maybe we should just do a selected poem since you haven't done one before. And I started thinking that he was going to say that he wasn't going to do the War book. So I said, what if we smash the two books together? But it wouldn't be called New and Selected. It would just be Then the War, and then in small letters and selected poems. And this was a battle that went for 6 months because they kept saying it's still going to be called New and Selected. And finally I won the battle. And I also won the font battle. So Then the War is like super big on the cover, but you can barely read the part that says selected poems. And you can barely read my name. And I also thought that seemed right. So fine. But the curating of the selected poems part, I just did that overnight. They told me, you know, we need to move quickly on this. So I thought I can have the selected poems for you by tomorrow morning. And that night I just sat there and I went through all my books and thought, I think you'll all do. In the way I usually put books together, I can't think too much about it. If I think I'm putting a book together, it'll be screwed up. So I just kind of did things. And then the next morning, I removed a couple and added a couple of others, but I wanted to just pick ones that could stand on their own. But if they were together, you would get enough of a sort of sense of what the original context had been. I don't know. I feel like that's a very rambling answer, but yeah, so it was more like a weird publishing thing that led to this book that has a whole book. I got this review in England. What they said is that Carl Phillips's new book has a whole brand new book of poems on its shoulder or something like that. And I kind of like that. Or I guess I'm carrying the selected poems on my shoulder, but I've got a new book. And it's a kind of weird book. But anyway, I like the idea that Then the War itself is a whole contained book already. And the only thing that's slightly strange about that is at the last minute, I decided to add a prose piece that I had done, an essay on trees. And I saw that the essay was in 14 sections. And I thought that would be like a prose sonnet in some way. So I sort of jammed that in there. And I kind of liked how because it's sort of memoiristic, I don't know. I like the idea that people could see the poems and then they could sort of maybe get a sense of who's behind the poems. And, you know, because I don't like it how people often assume poems are completely the truth and autobiography. So, but the memoir piece is more autobiography. Okay, I'm going to stop talking now.
What about the banned poem? We still have that question hanging out there.
What about, it was, that poem was taken, you know how the Academy of American Poets has Poem a Day, and they feature a different poem every day. And so the editor of whatever the month was asked me for a poem, and I sent that poem, and he said, that's great. We're going to take it. And then a couple months later, actually 6 months later, someone from the Academy said, oh, we can't publish this poem. It's not suitable because of, we're serialized and a lot of high school students read our poems every day. And I said, well, I don't think there's anything in there that high school students don't know about. And, you know, that's not, and they said, oh no, we can't. So they didn't like it that there was fucking, that I said there was fucking, that it was two men who looked too young to be fucking. So it was getting into that weird world. I don't think they liked the king's cock, even though I think that's quite a nice, tender moment. It's just, you know, what's so hard about that? And so they said, no, we can't do it. And they took a different poem. But I did tell them, I said, okay, but every time I read that poem, I'm going to say it was banned and tell the story. So And here I am telling the story.
Here you are. That's good. That's good. Thank you for sharing that. And we have a couple more really good questions here, but just talking about putting things together, how books come together. Sophia, I was very curious about your memoir because all the chapters are very small. It's a very short stories, and it's not chronological, and yet it is chronological in some ways. So I wanted you to maybe talk a little bit about that, about the form and structure and how you put everything together and what that process was like for you.
First, Carl is over here cracking me up. So it's hard for me to focus on my book. But okay, let me try. So let's see. I started with small moments. I think the chapters are short and episodic because I have a terrible memory and I can't remember whole long stretches of time in narrative and write it in the way that would make sense to anyone. But what I can remember are small moments in great detail. So I leaned into that, and that's how I wrote my chapters. As I mentioned, sort of mentioned briefly, I started as a journalist. So there is a bit of reporting that I did, and writing memoir was not really in my wheelhouse. Telling a story in the first person at first was very daunting for me. And so I had to get used to drilling into my own memory and to my own experience and really focusing on it enough to tell a story about it. And those small moments helped me to do that because it didn't seem quite as large if I could just focus on a small piece of the story and then, move forward that way. Okay, what's the next small piece that I can tell? Okay, what's the next small piece that I can tell? And eventually have them come together. But yes, the structure in terms of it being chronological and not had to do with me telling a story that had a forward progress from my point of view, but then also telling a story that went back in time and had a forward progress from my parents' point of view. So after that introductory third or fourth of the book, I go back to when my father was growing up, and then a bit about when my mother was growing up, and then kind of bring back into my own childhood chapters and kind of intersperse them like a braid. And as more, I'm a journalist, but I'm also an essay writer. So as an essayist, I felt a little bit more comfortable with the braid. Like, okay, I can see how these threads are coming together. It just worked in my head better that way in pieces. And so that's how I told the story. It was a few different parts together as one to tell this singular story that, yeah, it's a mishmash. So it's kind of messy, but I hope it comes together in a way that still allows people to understand what I'm trying to get across.
It definitely does. Actually, I love the structure of it, and I love the parallel of going back in time between your parents' story and your story, and then sometimes your grandparents' story too, and how that all came together. It's I was listening to, and I definitely want to get to these other questions, but a podcast a friend recommended, and within the mix of this discussion that was going on, there was a statement that said, "You may think you're done with the past, but the past is not done with you." And
Never.
I thought about that as I was reading your book and how everything is related.
Yeah. I felt it was really important to talk about my grandparents too, because I I remember them so vividly, even though, they passed away such a long time ago, and I could see their lasting impact on my parents. And so I wanted to make sure that I got them into the story. And when I was at the point where I was trying to sell the book, I felt like, oh, you know what? There is something out there that has the structure, and it was the show This Is Us. I wrote it before the show came out, but then when the show came out, like, they're doing what I was doing. Like, here's a parent story, here's a children's story, and kind of the ties together. I was like, oh, that's the same thing. So I'm glad that someone else found the structure and it works for them too.
Yes, very much so, very much so. So we have another question here. It's a very provocative question. You both write in response to centuries-old traditions, Islam, the classical world, and Christianity. How do these traditions shape your work, even if it's as you push against them? Either one of you.
Well, I guess I don't know. I mean, I guess what I can say, because I don't know entirely what my relationship is to classical literature and all that, but I was talking to a class earlier today about how what I discovered when I was an undergraduate and started reading Greek tragedy is that all those tragedies, they take place at the intersection of two things, of how a person wants to behave and how society tells them they're supposed to behave. And that's the conflict that always happens. So we get like Antigone wants to bury her dead brother because that's what a good sister does, buries her brother. But her brother has been labeled a traitor. And so it's against the law for anyone to give him a decent burial. So she's kind of stuck in this bind. She can either be a criminal to the state or she can fail to do her family duty. And I, even though I didn't make a conscious connection at the time, but I realized that why I was drawn to that intersection is because that's been my whole life, starting with being biracial and being told that you're the product of something that's often illegal, morally wrong somehow, that you're not quite Black enough, you're not white enough, what are you? So that idea of knowing yourself, but being told by others who you're supposed to be, fits who I am. And then once I understood about being queer, obviously that is another example of how the body knows one thing, but society is saying, oh, this is somehow wrong and abnormal. So I don't know, that seems a nugget of classical tradition that I sort of, it's kind of a place where I found my subject matter, or found that my subject matter had a place, and a very ancient place, that it's been obviously centuries of people having human desires and impulses and being told to stop acting on those impulses. So I think I just keep that alive in some way. And yeah. What say you, Sophia?
Thanks. I think for me, it was important to tell a story about Islam in America for Black people, because I didn't see a lot of that story being told. While I mentioned Malcolm X in the beginning, and lots of people have read his autobiography, since that point, there really hadn't been a Black Muslim story told that kind of rose to the fore of American psyche. Not that mine is doing that, but just the fact that I think there should be more stories out there that kind of give voice to what it is to be Muslim in any iteration of it. Because the more you tell stories about people, the more they become people, like regular people that you would see on the street and understand at least a little kernel about. And I just feel like that is so important to kind of demystify this whole thing about Islam, and particularly Black Islam. And if no one else was going to tell the story, then why not me? So that's kind of where I come in with the idea of the centuries-old tradition.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you for those answers. I have another couple for both of you, and as we Sophia, yes. Much of the story explores the splintering of multi-generational family expectations with regard to religion. And its family stayed connected. What do you attribute this to?
Okay, thanks. I wonder if your cat is on your microphone because it got a little muffled there, but I think I'm reading the question on the chat to see. Simple answer, I would just say love. My family loves each other. And, regardless of any disappointments, frustration, anger, just disagreements that have happened over years, they still come back to each other. As you might imagine, my father was not thrilled with this book when he read it, And so, there was a time when there was not the best of relationship or connection between he and I. But time has passed and now he's back to the same old calling me every day and sending me things all the time in the mail and, calling me up to tell me about some politician or religious person who's on a TV program. So I think that there is just a strong bond of love that connects people no matter what happens, at least in my family. I wish that were the same for all families, but at least in my family, I think that foundation is there, and there's not a whole lot that can break it.
Thank you. And I apologize for the cat. The cat does not apologize to anyone for anything, but I am sorry. I think she was in the way. Uh, Thank you, Sophia. That's I appreciate that answer. So we have a question for Carl about the title, Then the War. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah. Um, I mean, there's a poem called Then the War in the book. And in which some people make a sort of life together, and then war comes about, and it would seem, at least at the end, that if they aren't dead, they're somehow they have nothing at the end but each other, and that at least is where we leave them. That I think it ends with, then the war was nothing that mattered, that troubled them, if it ever had, or something like that. And elsewhere, there's a poem called Fixed Shadow, Moving Water. And that poem ends with this idea about tenderness, if we can make from tenderness a revolution. And so I was interested in this idea. I've been thinking a lot about what's political, because I've always been told my poems aren't political in the right way. And I was thinking about this idea of tenderness as a weapon, as a way of creating a shield from things. And I think it's something I was thinking about because of the last few years, 4 years, not just pandemic, but all the last presidency, all that stuff, of just feeling like there was true insanity, and thinking, oh, this is, maybe this is all, and feeling hopeless about being able to change it, but then thinking, but all we have to do is have a few people. Maybe this resonates with what Sophia was just saying about love, that maybe all we have to do is, if we have just a few people whom we can trust and whom we can hold fast to, then maybe we can effect small change within our small circle of lives. Maybe it doesn't change the world, but it's something. So somehow that, and then war, they came together for me. And I thought of this book as being like, okay, enough already in some way of just everything that's been happening. So in a sense, it's a war, but a sort of combating of the war of indifference and increasing in sensitivity there seems to be to people's individuality, and the sort of random cruelty and indifference, I guess, that there seems to be, that was only fueled by the last presidency. And so I feel as if, okay, this is a sort of pushback against that, a kind of war against that, I suppose. Also, just like the title, I like the idea of Then the War. Like, it sounds like what was before. I like the kind of, we're in the midst of something, and I don't know, a title that starts with an adverb, which I think then is. So these are the kinds of things I think about. I'll think, oh, I've had preposition titles, so let's have one with an adjective, or Then the War. That's not a title they'll think Carl would have, so I'll have it. That's the answer.
Well, on that note, there was a question that I missed there, about the titles of your poems and how intriguing they are, and a question about how those titles emerge for you.
Mm. Usually very randomly. It's the last thing I come up with, and it often is weeks before I have a title. And in general, I don't like titles that point directly to the poem. So like a title like, The Dog Walk, and then it opens, I was walking my dog. That's unsurprising to me. So I like strange, provocative titles, like the kind you see in abstract paintings sometimes that don't solve the painting in front of you. They kind of invite you to start thinking, what's the relationship between that title and what I'm seeing? And sometimes I think of titles and poems as Mark Rothko paintings. He has those two squares of color usually. And so here's one block, contains the title, and here's the poem. And I feel like the point of those paintings is relationality, just to sort of think about, how does green next to yellow, what kind of thoughts does it conjure for me? So sometimes it's that. But I have often in the last few years been taking titles from my own poems. So I won't be able to come up with a title. So I'll go to an old poem of mine and just come upon a phrase and think that would be an interesting title. And I like this idea that I'm kind of stitching backwards, stitching the old poems into the new in some strange way. I'd like to imagine some PhD student thinking this was something to make a deal about and write a dissertation on, when it's just like Carl couldn't come up with an idea. So he just robbed his own poems. But yeah, I don't know. I will say most of my titles just come out of nowhere. I wrote a poem the other day that I didn't have a title for, and then I was walking my dog, and the phrase "familiar in what way" occurred to me, and I thought that is the title of that poem. I have no idea why, but so far it's working. I don't know. It's instinctive, intuitive, magic.
Kind of like a lemon pie. I was thinking about your Instagram. Yes. Kind of like a lemon pie, rind and all. It's kind of magical.
That's right.
Yes. Thank you for that answer. I think that's just something we all wonder about, how these things come about, and so it's fun to discuss it. So and the questions just keep coming. Then we're going to start to wrap up, so we can let everyone go for the evening. But Sophia, this is for you. If you were to select just one chapter of your book to share with a group of young adults to provoke new meaning, which one would you choose?
Well, I have this chapter about my mother that my mother asked that question. So I'm telling her that it's the one about her, because I actually do love reading that chapter. That kind of goes back to when she was a teenager, and she had this idea that she was going to change her hair from her press and curl to an afro in the early 1970s, and her mother hated it. And I feel like it really does touch upon the whole generational conflict idea that happens between parent and child in every generation. And so I would choose that chapter because it's relatable in terms of the struggles that we go through to try to get to that next step in our lives, to try to get to that next step in progress in our society, and how hard you have to push against what the norm is and the status quo is, and how you want there to be some sort of a change, but it's not going to come probably until you upset somebody. So I would choose that chapter. I think it's called Her Own Way.
I will tell you, that's my favorite chapter.
Is it? That's great.
It's my favorite chapter. And I was talking with a friend about it last night, that there's a particular moment in that chapter that I just really thought was so beautiful. It's this very quiet moment where there is the conflict between mother and daughter. And any of us daughters who had such conflicts with our mothers, we know what that's like. But then from behind, her father speaks, and you describe his soft, Georgia accent, and he says, I think it looks nice. I think she looks nice.
I'm so heartwarmed that you picked up on that piece, because yes, and I know my mother's listening. We both love her father, my grandfather, dearly, and that's exactly how he was. Just that calming, gentle presence who can kind of just set everything at ease and everyone at ease, just with a simple phrase.
It was such a tender moment to me that it really did kind of, it choked me up to
Oh,
to
that's
read
great.
that. And so I'm so glad that was your favorite. It was beautiful. Okay, I think we have one last request. Carl, I don't know if you're taking requests from the audience, but we have had a request for you to read Gladiator.
Sorry. I hate it when people don't unmute and then here I'm being that person. I don't have it. It was in it's somewhere, like I'd have to find it. It was in the Atlantic Monthly Online on Sunday. So you could also just go to the Atlantic Monthly Online. Is that terrible?
That's not terrible.
I mean, you know, I'd have to go across the room and I'd have to dig it up and you'd see my slovenly office. I'm glad people like it though.
Well, James Hall has very kindly given the link for it in the Atlantic, and so everyone can go to that on their own time and enjoy it. And so, thank you very much to Mr. Hall.
How do people figure this stuff out? How I don't even know how to put a link in the chat. Goodness.
Well, thank you all. Do we have any more questions from the audience? These have been wonderful questions, and I've loved what the answers that we've received.
I just want to say thank you, everybody, for listening. Thanks for staying. Thanks for your questions. I really appreciate it.
I do too. And thank you, Sophia, for your beautiful reading. And it's wonderful to meet you, if only this way. I hope we'll meet in person one day.
Yes, and thank you for your poetry as well. Very, very good. I loved it so much.
It was wonderful. Yes, thank you all for joining us and